All right, guys, Murph and Leia are here, and today we're going to talk about the 6.5 by 52 millimeter Carcano. The cartridge, not necessarily any of the rifles chambered in it, though the rifles will play a portion in the conversation as we move through this. We're going to discuss its history, get into some of its technical data, follow that up with some contextual data, and do a little comparison before everything is said and done. Now, first off, with the history, we have to go back to the black powder cartridge era, in which there was a major technological threshold that was holding back pretty much every military of the time. The goal was to get past 2,000 feet per second with a small caliber projectile. This is a time where military cartridges were characterized as being between 40 and 45 caliber and coming in at roughly 1,900 feet per second. There was a lot of issue trying to get past that point. Small diameter projectiles existed, however, they did not necessarily reach out to the same ranges that other cartridges did efficiently. At this time, in order to be able to get more velocity, more distance, and all those types of things, you had to combine that with a larger cartridge casing. So at a certain point, you wind up having a howitzer that you're shouldering if you're trying to get to a certain velocity threshold, or some of the velocity thresholds that we have now here today in the modern sense. This is something that we lose track of in the modern sense. We have a tendency to think of things as like, well, 2,600 feet per second is actually kind of slow. 3,000 feet per second and beyond, that's where it's at. That's fast. Over 2,000 feet per second at this time would be considered fast. When the French unveiled smokeless powder in 1886, that changed everything, and it touched off a arms race very similar to that as what we would see during the Cold War with nukes and all that kind of stuff. Same overall principle. Every military needed to get a hold of this type of technological advantage in order to be able to be relevant on the battlefield of the future. So with this, everybody started adopting new cartridges in smaller diameters. Now, a lot of them would go with like something close to 30 cal, 7.92 by 57 millimeter Mauser, 8 millimeter Lebel, 30-06, 303, so on and so forth. And we may not necessarily consider 30 caliber projectiles in today's vernacular to be small bore cartridges, but for the time coming off of a minimum of 40 caliber, they most definitely are. Today, 30 caliber is kind of like the standard. Sure, there are larger bore cartridges out there than 30 caliber, but when you're talking about hunting, most, like at least in North America and a lot of your plains game and stuff like that in Africa, you're still talking about 30 caliber projectiles for the most part, with some variants. That is my favorite. Okay, so lots of military started adopting these new cartridges. They're pushing the velocity envelope up to like 2,400 feet per second. The Italians would hop in on this in 1891 with the 6.5 millimeter Carcano, named for the developer whose last name Carcano. I cannot remember his first name for the life of me right now. It doesn't really matter, has no real bearing on what it is that we're discussing. And they would adopt this in a 162 grain bottle-nosed FMJ cartridge, which is very indicative of initial smokeless powder cartridges. A lot of them were very large, heavy projectiles with round noses for the time period. The next technological advantage would take place before the turn of the century with Spitzer or pointed type ammunition, in which most militaries would go with much smaller projectiles, much lighter projectiles that are now pointed, which gives them more aerodynamics, which gives them a better association with point blank range. Now, this entire thing, be it going with small bore black powder cartridges into the smokeless powder cartridges and all this kind of stuff, the whole idea is to get a better relationship with point blank range, to have to make less adjustment to your sights in order to be able to engage a target out to distance. Black powder cartridge rear sights were characterized as being very tall because you really had to like have this rainbow-like trajectory in order to be able to shoot those cartridges a great distance. You were lobbing them in at that point, which changed how it is that you could perceive your target. It changed how it is that you could make adjustments and all that kind of stuff on the fly whenever it is that you're going through a multi-shot engagement. If you missed and you weren't necessarily able to view your target when you squeeze the trigger, it's more difficult to be able to make those adjustments as you need. By going with something that had a flatter shooting trajectory, you had more opportunity to be able to view your results on target to be able to make adjustments as necessary. Now, the Italians would be the first one to go with a 6.5 millimeter. Previously, the smallest diameter cartridge was the 7 millimeter Mauser. And as much as they were very progressive in choosing the 6.5 millimeter cartridge, they did not necessarily take advantage of the next technological advancement. And I have two theories for this, why they stuck with the 162 grain round nose projectile. Number one, 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 162 grain round nose projectile. Num the Italians had an early issue with the 6.5 millimeter ammunition. Something that we have to keep in mind with 6.5 millimeter ammunition is that we often characterize it as being a very long, slender projectile, which means that we have lots of contact with the bore, lots of bearing surface. And whenever this cartridge is introduced to rotational forces and stuff like that, if you don't have good bonding between your jacket and your core, that bullet is going to unmake itself. And that's what was happening with early 6.5 Carcano rounds. The Italians would combat this by going with progressive twist rifling, which the twist rate of the rifling would increase as the barrel increased. So down towards the chamber, it would be very slow and it would be very fast by the time you got out, or faster by the time you got out to the muzzle. This gave them a positive outcome with their 6.5 millimeter ammunition, because the other thing that plays into this is that Italian manufacturing was not where it probably needed to be. Now, Italy was an industrialized nation. However, they did not necessarily have the same technology or industrial capacity as other countries, say like Russia or the United States, so on and so forth. So they were looking for very simple fixes in both their rifle design as well as their cartridge design. So perhaps they could have invested more time and energy and ultimately production into creating rounds that had better bonding between the jacket and the core. But something else we have to keep in mind, guys, is that bonding between dissimilar metals like that, that's something that has been a perpetual development in ammunition across a century. Like 30 years ago, we were still talking about what it took to be able to have soft point ammunition expand properly in target media while also maintaining structural integrity, instead of the base detaching from the rest of the projectile and ice picking through the animal, leaving behind the expansion and not necessarily getting the best terminal ballistics inside of that particular target media. This is something that has still been going through a lot of development, a lot of processes and stuff like that, and will continue to do so as ammunition gets faster in the future, whatever it is that we have coming up on the horizon, as pressures get higher and all that kind of stuff. Lots of things play into this type of thing, and this is something that the Italians were not necessarily willing to invest the resources, the time, all that kind of stuff in order to be able to have a positive benefit with it. Instead, they changed the rifling in the rifle so that they could better accommodate their ammunition production capabilities of the time. Now, this cartridge would be their standard issue military cartridge all through World War I and through some of the interwar period. However, some experiences in Africa in the interwar period would drive the Italians to decide to change their outlook on 6.5 millimeter. Even though they led the charge on 6.5 millimeter military cartridges, they quickly found that they did not feel that they were getting the wounding capability out of the 6.5 that they wanted. And we'll talk about that more once we get into the contextual aspect of this. So with that being the case, they would wind up going to the 7.35 millimeter Carcano. But as it would turn out, the timing on that was miserable, because the Italians would join the Germans in the Axis during World War II, and they adopted the 7.35 shortly before the beginning of hostilities in World War II. This is one of many Italian missteps in which they proved that logistics is a major portion of warfighting functions. Like, you can't really do much without logistics, and the Italians would pretty much do everything they could to complicate their own logistics, it would appear. So, having adopted the 7.35 so close to joining in World War II, the Italians had not yet gotten the chance to fully divest themselves of the 6.5 millimeter ammunition, and ultimately supply chain complications as well as production capacity would wind up bringing them back full circle to the 6.5 millimeter Carcano, turning the 7.35 into something that would go to rear echelon troops. Keep in mind, guys, the Italians were involved in Africa. They were involved in the fighting in Sicily, Salerno, and Italy, as well as sending 10 divisions to the Eastern Front. The Italians played a huge portion in World War II, even if they were a early dismissal, I guess we could say, even though they were defeated by the Allies early on. So we could see where they had a lot of issues with production capacity and all that kind of stuff. Turns out fighting multi-fronts in a war is a problem. Who knew? So, post-war, the Carcano rifles would be surplused out, as would the ammunition. Actually, Winchester would get a hold of some 6.5 Carcano ammunition, military ammunition, and they would pull the original bullets and replace them with soft points for hunting type stuff. However, the 6.5 Carcano did not necessarily catch on in a big way. Post-war, there was a lot of interest in new development in hunting type cartridges, and cartridges like the 270 Winchester and the 308 and even the venerable 30-06 would really put the 6.5 Carcano on the back burner. especially as surplus ammunition dwindled away. And you see this a lot of times all throughout history. At one point, when people would get a hold of Mosin Nagants for cheap, they would go ahead and get them for $100. People would buy Mosin Nagants for $100, and when you could still buy 7.62x54 for whatever change you pulled out of your couch cushions, they would readily buy 7.62x54. But as the supply of Mosin Nagants dried up and the ammunition became more expensive, Mosin Nagants became less and less interesting to more and more people. To now, whenever you buy a Mosin Nagant, you're also buying that person's ammunition. They're going to wind up throwing it in there with them because, just like the 6.5 Carcano, there's really nothing else chambered for it. This is starting to segue us into our contextual portion. I don't want to get too far into that because we still need to hit a high note, the last high note of the 6.5 Carcano, which is the assassination of a sitting president. A Carcano 3841 Chambern 6.5 Carcano with an aftermarket scope installed, provided by an importer that was sporterizing Carcano rifles, was credited with the assassination of JFK in the hands of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, whether or not that's actually what happened and all that kind of stuff is not the topic of this video, and I would be interested to see your thoughts on it in the comments section. But that was the last time the 6.5 Carcano had any real interest. Since then, the 6.5 Carcano ammunition has dried up to where the only manufacturer that I'm aware of providing 6.5 Carcano is mostly PPU, with Norma also producing its own load. But for the most part, like most of my 6.5 Carcano ammunition is from PPU, because PPU is the best friend of anybody who shoots military surplus rifles. I have a lot of PPU ammunition in a variety of surplus chamberings. All right, guys, that pretty much covers history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the technical data of this particular cartridge, starting off with a little bit of size association. On the left is the 7.62x54, in the middle is the 6.5 Carcano, and on the right is the 6.5 Swede. Now, the 6.5 Carcano is originally a 160 to 162 grain projectile, though it can be found currently on the market in 123 grain and 139 grain loadings, in addition to Norma's 157 grain soft point. Excuse me. The original diameter of the 6.5 Carcano is 0.268. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. The projectiles can be found in soft points, FMJs, and then in a military loading, they were produced in tracers, armor piercing, incendiary, all those types of things. The 6.5 Carcano was also chambered in machine guns for the time period. Hi, kitten. You're very comfortable. You're all comfy in there. The cartridge casing is necked, 52 millimeters in length, rimless, and center primed. Velocities come in to around 2,300 feet per second for the most part. I believe there are some loadings that get as high as like maybe 24, possibly 25, but you're not necessarily going to find a diverse number of loadings in the 6.5 Carcano. We'll get into that more here in our contextual portion, starting now. One of the biggest issues with the 6.5 Carcano comes down to bullet diameter. The original bullet diameter, as previously mentioned, was 0.268. However, current 6.5 loadings, since the 6.5 Carcano has come out, have standardized around a 0.264. Now, the measurement from a Carcano rifle is 0.264 to the lands, 0.268 to the grooves. So, a .264 projectile will still pass down the bore of a Carcano rifle without necessarily rattling around in there or doing any kind of wonky stuff, but it's not necessarily getting the best gas seal, which means that it's not getting the best accuracy, it's not getting the best velocity. And those are the things that we have to take into account whenever it is that we're talking about the 6.5 Carcano. Already, when we're talking about military surplus rifles, we're not talking about premium accuracy rifles to begin with. Already, those were men-of-the-man rifles, and age has not done them any favors. A lot of early military ammunition was corrosively primed, which means that the guns were not properly maintained, especially if they were shot post-war with surplus ammunition that was corrosively primed. You are likely to find a lot of degraded bores, already going to impact accuracy. In addition to that, a lot of Carcano rifles were sporterized because they were not considered to be very prized rifles. So this also puts you into a bad relationship with the twist rate of the rifle having been potentially cut down, as well as when you're utilizing this light for caliber light for what the original loading was supposed to be and smaller diameter than what the original loading was supposed to be, the deck is completely stacked against any Carcano rifle for accuracy. And that's one of the major portions whenever it is that we talk about this. This cartridge never got picked up by Winchester. It never got picked up by Remington. You're not going to find 700s or Model 70s or Ruger Americans or anything like that chambered in the 6.5 Carcano. It just didn't catch on in that way. Why is that, Murph? Well, a lot of this I think has to do with preconceived notions. American shooters and soldiers were perfectly willing to accept the quality of Mauser or German-produced weapons in general. However, when it comes to Italians and Japanese, for some reason we have a blind spot where we're automatically convinced that all of those rifles are just junk, that they have poor metallurgy, that they were poorly designed, poorly produced, and all those types of things. The reality is just not that. Those rifles are plenty capable. They are still military rifles. The Arisakas, even in their late war, last-ditch type configuration, which I talked about in my Arisaka review, which if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description. But they are still considered by many to be unsafe to shoot. They're considered to be walking hand grenades and all that kind of stuff. And that's not necessarily the case. Those rifles are still perfectly capable. The Carcano action was at one point rechambered into 8mm Mauser for use by the Volkssturm in the defense of Berlin against the Red Army. Now, most people will tell you that those rifles are unsafe to shoot because they are way more potent than what the original 6.5 chambering is. And I can understand that determination. However, something to keep in mind, nobody wins a war by doing the enemy's job for them. So if I hand you a rifle and it explodes and kills you or injures you or in some way renders you incapable of being able to fight the enemy, I did not succeed at all. Even if you got 5 shots off before it detonated in your hands, those 5 shots don't necessarily mean 5 kills. I need you to stay in the fight for as long as you can. So I need you to have a rifle that allows you to do that, or a machine gun, or a hand grenade, or a howitzer, or whatever. If you're out there with a howitzer battery and you're giving them faulty ammunition that explodes once every 100 rounds, you're going to run out of howitzers real fast, and howitzers win wars. So I never really agreed with this overall concept. Now, are they necessarily going to be able to handle a lifetime of 8mm Mauser? I don't know. I have not shot an 8mm Mauser chambered Carcano for a lifetime's worth of shooting to be able to determine whether or not it will last. I'm not a gunsmith who has the ability to be able to check the headspace or the degradation over time of a 6.5 Carcano, or excuse me, of a Carcano rifle chambered in 8mm Mauser. It's not necessarily something I have access to. It's something that I would love for somebody to pipe up with in the comments section if they do have that type of experience. But this is one of the issues that kept the 6.5 Carcano relegated to the background, was a preconceived notion that it could not withstand these higher pressures, and therefore it did not get invested the interest, in addition to some perhaps wartime propaganda playing its part that the enemy's weapon is trash and therefore should be regarded as garbage and treated as such. You get the same type of thing with Mosin-Nagants. A lot of people will tell you that Mosin-Nagants are not capable of being able to perform at a higher level, yet 100% those actions are strong. They are still military actions, even if they aren't Mauser actions. We need to keep in mind that Mauser actions are overbuilt. Everything else is built to a more reasonable level of pressure that is still higher than what the average person is probably going to experience. Now, I've been down this rabbit hole for a little while. Let's get back into the contextual portion of this. The 6.5 Carcano as a 6.5mm cartridge does not have the same relationship with flat shooting trajectory that you would find out of, say, a 6.5 Swede. The 6.5 Swede is a fantastically flat shooting cartridge. However, the 6.5 Carcano being built around that original 160 grain loading, if you look at the rear sight on a Carcano rifle, it's pretty steep. There's a lot of drop that you're compensating for with that particular cartridge, unlike a 6.5 Carcano that's pretty flat shooting, or excuse me, a 6.5 Swede that's pretty flat shooting. Especially since the 6.5 Swede got the advantage of the later Spitzer development, allowing it to increase its velocity to 2,600 feet per second and providing it with a more aerodynamic projectile in order to be able to shoot flatter. Now, the 6.5 Carcano in general has a reputation for inaccuracy, and a lot of this has to do with surplus rifles, but also exploratorized rifles that have been cut down, ammunition that's not capable of being able to get the most out of its accuracy, as well as not having an aerodynamic shape. Now, I have often believed that when it comes to PPU and their 123 and 139 grain loadings, that those are just repurposed 6.5 Grendel and 6.5 Swede rounds. Now, the bullets look more rounded than what I would commonly associate with those other loads, but that's just what I hear whenever it is that I hear those loadings. I have nothing to necessarily be able to prove it. I'm not a PPU insider. All right, so contextually, the 6.5 Carcano is slow, not that flat shooting. I never necessarily got the benefit of a lot of aftermarket support in order to be able to make it a more relevant cartridge for anybody's uses. It sounds like the 6.5 Carcano is just a whole bunch of downs, just nothing good about it. No X's in its win column. And for the most part, that's pretty accurate. Do I think that's fair? Not particularly. I think in a lot of ways, the 6.5 Carcano could have been good, especially in short action rifles and all that kind of stuff. Kind of in the same way that when I did my 7.62 by 25 Tokarev review, which if you're interested in that, link in the description, in which if that cartridge had been paired with more modern firearms, it would be a more viable modern cartridge. However, the reality did not necessarily turn out that way. And that's kind of getting into conclusions here. We're not going to spend too much time on this. Let's get into the comparisons portions here. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how it is that I want to do comparison for this particular cartridge. Did I want to put it up against some of its contemporary 6.5 millimeter modern loadings like the 6.5 Creedmoor? No, in that case, that's kind of setting the 6.5 Carcano up for failure. The 6.5 Creedmoor is purpose-built as a long-range cartridge. The 6.5 Carcano was designed as a military cartridge, so that's not necessarily a good comparison. I thought about throwing it up against some of its 30 caliber contemporaries from other militaries, like the 30-06 or the 8mm Mauser. However, those cartridges, in addition to being substantially longer than a 6.5 Carcano, also got the advantage of the lighter projectiles with the Spitzer type bullet. They have much higher velocities, running closer to 2,900 feet per second, and are just going to smoke a 6.5 Carcano. So that's not necessarily a good comparison there. So what I decided to go with was a kind of niche 6.5 loading from Mauser, the 6.5 by 57mm Mauser, which came out around like 1893, 1894, and was a neck down version of the 7 by 57mm Mauser, which was a popular military cartridge. Now, as far as I know, the 6.5 Mauser was not necessarily adopted by any military. However, it has had some success in Europe as well as like African Plains game for hunting. Now, one of the issues I ran into in trying to do this comparison was finding loads that were comparable, and also an app that would support both cartridges. So I had an app that had 6.5 Mauser in it, but did not have 6.5 Carcano. I went to another app that did have 6.5 Mauser and 6.5 Carcano, but it didn't really have any loads entered for 6.5 Carcano. So I had to draw some loads from one of my cartridge books, input that information, and then run the two cartridges against one another. So I selected a 132 grain 6.5 Mauser up against a 140 grain 6.5 Carcano. We can go ahead and look at these charts here. The biggest thing that I look for whenever it is that I do these comparisons is when do we drop below 2,000 feet per second? When do we start reaching into those black powder velocities that everyone was trying to get away from with the development of these smokeless powder cartridges? And for the 6.5 Mauser, that happens around about 225 yards. With the 6.5 Carcano, that happens around 125 yards. Now, the 6.5 Carcano loading that I selected is starting off with about 2,300-ish feet per second velocity, whereas the 6.5 Mauser is starting off about 2,500 feet per second. So already we're having a significant difference there. 8 grains, I don't know necessarily translates to 200 feet per second in difference, but 5 millimeters longer cartridge casing with 8 grains could definitely accommodate for the difference there. This is not necessarily the best apples to apples comparison, but these are two rather niche 6.5 millimeter loadings. Now, the 6.5 Carcano and 6.5 Mauser have rather similar ballistic trajectories, which I found to be kind of surprising. And some of this could be that even though this is 132 grain 6.5 by 57mm Mauser we're talking about, it's not necessarily barn burning in ballistics. I would expect a little bit higher for that loading at that case length. So perhaps not necessarily getting the best advantages of its properties at that point, but it is still handily beating out the 6.5 Carcano when it comes to velocity and energy and all those types of things that are going to matter whenever it is that you're making engagements out to these distances. All right, guys, so that's our comparison portion. Why don't we go ahead and get into my recommendations? Would I recommend the 6.5 Carcano for duty type use? When you consider that I have to take the 6.5 Carcano at what is available in the chambering? Absolutely not. And this is where we kind of cross over into, we're not just talking about the cartridge, we're talking about also the platforms that it can be utilized in. The cartridge itself would perform just fine if you paired it with modern loadings in a modern platform and all those types of things. If you're talking about trying to run any version of a Carcano bolt action rifle in duty type applications, you're setting yourself up for failure. So I would not recommend it for duty type use based on what's actually available. Would I recommend it for home defense, self-defense? It would be better than throwing rocks, especially once we come back to what it is that it's actually chambered in. But it would not necessarily be my first choice. If all you had was an old military Carcano or a sporterized Carcano, and that's what you had for home defense, then absolutely good luck. But if you live in a more suburban area, if you live in an apartment or something along those lines, I would not recommend the 6.5 Carcano for your defensive type purposes. I would implore you to find something else more viable, or to have a very good understanding of where you can and can't shoot in a defensive situation. Excuse me. So, it would not be my first choice for home defense use, but it's not like I don't run full power rifle cartridges off of my ready rack for home defense. I just have my pre-selected lanes of fire in order to be able to utilize those platforms. Okay, well, what about for competition type use? Well, it depends on the competition. If you're talking about utilizing this in some type of military surplus competition, which are very common in like Canada, Switzerland, the UK, Australia, other Commonwealth nations, then absolutely. You could probably get into some of the limited classes where you could take a 6.5 Carcano, make some adjustments, or like the unlimited classes, make some adjustments and get that rifle up to a fairly competitive vein of existence. If you look at like Bloke on the Range, which if you're interested in this type of content and you haven't watched Bloke on the Range's video, then you're definitely messing up. You need to go check that stuff out. You need to go check out his content. He has some stuff that's purpose built for those type of competitions for a more open type division than necessarily like stock military division. And I think a 6.5 Carcano being a fairly lightweight or a fairly light recoiling cartridge, which would pair very nicely with a very lightweight rifle, could be very relevant in those types of capacities. Now, if you were to be dead set on you're going to make this cartridge just everything that it could possibly be, and you want to do like PRS with a 6.5 Carcano because it's light recoiling, and when paired with a very heavy rifle, you're just not going to have any disturbance to your sights and all that kind of stuff, and you're going to take advantage of hand loading to the proper .268 diameter, or taking advantage of modern 6.5 millimeter barrels in order to be able to get the most out of the .264 loading, which I think would be far more viable, then yes, it would be great for PRS. But if you're talking about running the guns already available in 6.5 Carcano, as they are, would not recommend them for that purpose at all. Not even a little bit. Okay, well, what about as a hunting cartridge? Well, energy-wise, for relatively short shots, the 6.5 Carcano would be viable. A lot of it's going to come down to rifle platform yet again. If you're getting a custom rifle that you're tuning to the 6.5 Carcano for some reason, you decided that that's the path it is that you want to go down, then absolutely. More power to you. Have fun with it. The ammunition is going to cost you a lot because you're going to have to generate the brass, and 6.5 Carcano ammunition is running between $1 to over $2 a round. So keep that in mind. However, if that's the direction you wanted to go, more power to you. If you're talking about running off of existing platforms that are limited in their accuracy by not just the ammunition that's available, but also alterations or degradation that might have occurred or been made to the gun over time, your shots are going to be pretty short. You're not necessarily going to be hunting plains game, way out west. You might be doing a lot of fairly close shots at like in a swamp or something along those lines. Very dense brush type of stuff. What about as a woods gun? Well, the Carcano can be paired with lightweight rifles and is a light recoiling cartridge in order to make it something that would be relatively easy to pack around. Now, I'm not necessarily recommending this as a hiking gun as much as this might be something that you throw across the back seat of some type of utility vehicle to be able to bebop around your property, or perhaps you carry it with you whenever it is that you bebop around your property, and it's something that would be very advantageous for you for varmints of the 2 or 4-legged variety. It doesn't really matter in that case. It's not my first choice, but it wouldn't be my last choice either. It'd be pretty close though, if I'm being completely honest. What are my uses for the 6.5 Carcano? Well, I do have a sporterized Carcano rifle chambered in that cartridge that Though I have not hunted with, I would be willing to do brush hunting with. The cartridge at like a lot of your common sub 100 yards brush hunting type endeavors would still have plenty of energy at the relatively lackluster velocities that the cartridge comes out at. I could see it being a good pig gun if you're doing a lot of close-up pig hunting, and that's pretty much it. We're talking about very short-range deer hunting or very close-range pig hunting. That's how I see that cartridge fitting into my overall dynamic. I haven't done it yet, but I'm more than willing to do so. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.